We are often told that the fog of war obscures the truth. But what happens when the fog lifts and what remains is not a battlefield, but a third-grade classroom? When the line between military necessity and state-sanctioned extermination is erased before our very eyes. Welcome to the Mercer Global Brief. Today, we are not just looking at a conflict in the Middle East. We are witnessing the live-streamed autopsy of international law. For years, the international community has been force-fed a very specific, sanitized narrative. Whenever civilian infrastructure was reduced to rubble, we were handed the polished excuse of collateral damage, an errant missile, a tragic intelligence failure, a regrettable but unavoidable byproduct of complex urban combat. We wanted to believe it, because acknowledging the alternative is simply too grotesque for the human mind to easily process. But that illusion shatters completely when you examine the events of April 9, 2016. A third-grade Palestinian girl was sitting quietly in her classroom. There was no crossfire here, no mistaken identity from 30,000 feet in the air. Israeli soldiers stormed directly into that room and shot her dead in front of her entire class. Her father, consumed by an unimaginable grief, later shared that she had left for school that morning with a smile on her face, only to never return home. How do you explain away a point-blank execution with the narrative of a stray bomb? You simply cannot. When we look at the bedrock of modern international law, the 1949 Geneva Conventions established an absolute, undeniable red line regarding the protection of non-combatants, particularly children in conflict zones. Historically, the global order has recognized and punished this exact type of horror. Consider the siege of Sarajevo in the early 1990s, where snipers deliberately targeting children in what became known as Sniper Alley led to sweeping convictions for crimes against humanity at The Hague. The international tribunals established a clear precedent: a uniformed soldier who aims a weapon at a child is no longer a combatant. They are an executioner. While UN data shows that civilian casualty rates in modern urban warfare tragically hover around 90%, a point-blank assassination in an elementary school defies even the darkest statistics of asymmetric warfare. It forces us to confront a chilling reality about the intent behind the trigger. The classroom, once a universal sanctuary of innocence and future potential, has been transformed into a macabre theater of trauma. It is a stage where the ultimate sickening power dynamic is demonstrated. The cold steel of an assault rifle pressed against the vulnerability of a number 2 pencil. The fog of war is no longer a natural phenomenon on the battlefield. It is an artificial smokescreen pumped out by state public relations machines to cover up deliberate atrocities. You can blame a falling bomb on a glitch in a targeting computer, but a pulled trigger in a quiet classroom is the deliberate heartbeat of a dying conscience. What happens when the very institutions designed to preserve life are engineered to extinguish it? We are witnessing the systematic dismantling of the biological resilience of a population. Before this escalation, the healthcare system of Gaza was a fragile but functioning $1.5 billion infrastructure, holding roughly 3,500 hospital beds for over 2 million people. Today, an astonishing 94% of those medical facilities have been reduced to ash and twisted metal. Consider the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital. It was the only cancer treatment center in the entire Strip. Its destruction did not neutralize a military threat. It simply handed hundreds of terminal patients an agonizing, protracted death sentence. The successive military raids on Al-Shifa and Nasser hospitals, resulting in the executions of patients and medical staff, were not surgical strikes. They were the deliberate severing of the main arteries of a society. But dismantling the hospitals is only the first phase of this engineered collapse. We must examine the weaponization of basic human biology. When Israel backed the takeover of humanitarian distribution, they did not facilitate aid. They weaponized calories. Food distribution points were designated in isolated areas, open only during extreme, unpredictable time windows. They transformed life-saving relief into a lethal trap. Over 1,760 desperate, starving civilians have been gunned down by the military while simply trying to secure a bag of flour for their families. To grasp the unprecedented nature of this, look back at the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s. Even during the longest military blockade in modern history, the international community sustained Operation Provide Promise, airlifting thousands of tons of food and medicine to trapped civilians. A baseline of humanity, however thin, was maintained. Here, the blockade is absolute, utilizing starvation as a calculated instrument of war. This is not a traditional military siege, it is structural asphyxiation. It is the geopolitical equivalent of placing a pillow over the face of a dying patient and labeling it an administrative protocol. And let us be absolutely clear, when a loaf of bread is deployed as bait for the crosshairs of a sniper, starvation is no longer a tragic byproduct of combat. It is the apex predator of state policy. Let us talk about the math of erasure. In any standard geopolitical conflict of the 21st century, from the urban sieges in Iraq to the sprawling battlefields of Eastern Europe, the demographic breakdown of casualties typically follows a grim but predictable statistical curve historically across major global armed conflicts over the last 2 decades. Children account for roughly 8 to 12% of total fatalities. It is a horrific metric, but one that reflects the tragic, messy reality of traditional collateral damage. Now look at the ledger currently being written in Gaza. As of the latest harrowing tallies, we are looking at over 72,000 Palestinian deaths and more than 172,000 injured. But here is the data point that should completely freeze the geopolitical establishment. Over 21,000 of those killed are children. Do the math. We are no longer looking at an accidental deviation from the historical norm. We are witnessing a statistical anomaly so severe, so drastically skewed, that it can only be explained by absolute intentionality. And for the children who somehow survive the relentless bombardments, a different, more intimate kind of hell awaits. Medical reports indicate that roughly 5,000 individuals have been forced to undergo amputations, often without basic anesthesia, with children comprising a staggering and horrifying percentage of these procedures. What exactly is happening to the youth detained in this environment? The testimonies read like a manual from the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Beyond direct executions, there is a documented, systemic application of torture, severe beatings, electrocution, forced stress positions, sleep deprivation, and the pervasive use of sexual humiliation and rape threats. These are not the random, undisciplined actions of rogue infantrymen. This is an institutionalized methodology designed to break the human spirit at its most foundational level. Think of a society as a living biological organism. If your objective is to permanently cripple it, you do not merely bomb its present infrastructure, you surgically amputate its future. By systematically targeting the youth, shattering them physically, and scarring them psychologically. The architects of this campaign are engaging in a demographic scorched earth policy. It is a methodical harvest, where the crop is the next generation. The children of Gaza are not caught in the crossfire. They are the coordinates. When the primary demographic export of your military campaign is thousands of child amputees, you are no longer fighting a war of defense. You are pruning the family tree of an entire ethnicity. So, what is the ultimate endgame here? If the objective is not purely defensive, as the staggering civilian toll clearly proves, then what exactly is the grand strategy driving this machine? To understand this, we have to pull the camera back and look at the map, but not the map as it exists today. We must look at the map as it is envisioned by the ideological architects sitting in the highest echelons of the current Israeli cabinet. We are witnessing the final, violent burial of the two-state solution. The true objective unfolding before our eyes is the realization of Eretz Yisrael Hashalema, the ideological concept of a greater Israel. This is not a fringe, modern conspiracy. It is a political current deeply rooted in the revisionist Zionism of the 1920s, pioneered by figures who advocated for an iron wall of absolute military dominance. The modern iteration of this ideology no longer seeks an iron wall to defend its borders, but rather a moving wall to aggressively expand them. The rhetoric from senior ministers is chillingly transparent, floating proposals to push millions of Palestinians out into the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, or driving them north into Lebanon. On they wrap this forced demographic overhaul in the sterile, bureaucratic language of voluntary migration, a euphemism so dark it borders on the absurd. But if you want to know the truth of their intentions, ignore the press briefings and look at the hard data. The satellite imagery from orbit does not lie. Independent geographical analyses, including recent data synthesized by researchers utilizing open-source satellite radar, estimate that in northern Gaza alone, upwards of 70 to 80% of all physical structures have been severely damaged or completely flattened. Let that percentage sink in. You do not vaporize 80% of an entire urban infrastructure to root out a localized insurgency. You do it to fundamentally erase the topography. You do it to guarantee that when the smoke finally clears, there is literally nothing left for the survivors to return to. This is not a traditional military campaign. It is a man-made tectonic shift. We are watching the most violent real estate foreclosure in modern geopolitical history, an operation where the eviction notices are delivered by supersonic fighter jets, and the property developers arrive in armored tanks. The total destruction of the foundation of a society is not the tragic byproduct of this war. It is the absolute prerequisite for a complete regional reset. Because the cold, undeniable truth of the matter is this: you cannot negotiate a two-state solution with a government that has already drawn a one-state map. How does a state actor commit a genocide in broad daylight and still maintain a VIP invitation to the global diplomatic gala? The answer is as simple as it is deeply disturbing. They are granted an institutional invisibility cloak by the very nations that authored the rules-based international order. When we examine the mainstream Western media apparatus, we do not see objective journalism. We see a highly sophisticated laundering operation. The legitimate resistance, or even the mere existence of the Palestinian people, is immediately branded with the indelible pre-packaged label of terrorism. Their suffering is framed as an unfortunate necessity. Yet when a state military systematically starves a population and liquidates its medical infrastructure, it parades through the global public square wearing the unearned mask of a civilized democracy simply defending its borders. But public relations alone cannot sustain a war machine of this magnitude. It requires hard capital, and it requires impenetrable diplomatic armor. Enter the United States. The narrative of Washington acting as a neutral broker is the greatest geopolitical fiction of our time. America provides roughly $38 billion in a 10-year military assistance package. But let us look past the abstract dollar signs and examine the actual hardware. We are talking about the continuous transfer of Mk-84 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. These are devastating munitions designed to penetrate heavily reinforced concrete military installations, not to be dropped on densely packed refugee camps or fragile residential blocks. When you drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a tent city, you are not conducting a surgical strike. You are engineering a localized apocalypse. And when the rest of the planet attempts to hit the brakes, the diplomatic firewall activates. The United States has continuously utilized its veto power in the UN Security Council, single-handedly torpedoing over a dozen separate resolutions aimed at imposing basic sanctions or enforcing a ceasefire. This dynamic is the geopolitical equivalent of a courtroom where the presiding judge is simultaneously slipping the murder weapon to the defendant under the table, while publicly lecturing the jury on the sanctity of the law. Weak nations have no diplomacy, and backward nations only receive beatings. They are operating with absolute impunity because they know the umbrella of the superpower will shield them from the fallout. And make no mistake, this blueprint of expansion by force will not stop at the borders of Palestine. The crosshairs are already shifting, with military operations expanding into Lebanon and blatant, escalating threats directed at Iran. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of this tragedy is not just the sheer brutality, it is the normalization of it. When the civilized world funds barbarism with billions of dollars and diplomatic vetoes, the tombstone of international law has already been carved. We must ask ourselves, if the rules of human decency can be suspended so easily for them today, who will be pushed into the meat grinder tomorrow? Perhaps in the long, bloody history of human conflict, it is impossible to perfectly define the absolute heroes and villains of every war. But the distinction between humanity and sheer, unchecked barbarism is not a gray area. It is a glaring, unmistakable line drawn in the blood of the innocent. We should be thankful that there are still forces in this world with the capacity to push back, because the alternative is surrendering the future of this entire planet to the architects of a slaughterhouse.